Hello, this Science of Sport video focuses on BTEC Sport and Exercise Sciences, Unit 2 Functional Anatomy, the muscular system, and we're specifically looking at the location of skeletal muscles, which is Learning Aim E3. So here's the specification and the list of muscles that they wish for you to be able to identify and understand the movements that they generate. So when these muscles contract, what movements occur and over what joints. This obviously is an overview of a lot of, in fact most of the muscles that you need to appreciate. I'm going to go through sort of the muscle pairs in a moment and show you some specific diagrams, but essentially you might need to be able to identify from a sporting image of an action, a skill in a sport, what muscle is the agonist, what muscles are the antagonists or synergists or fixators, and you need to identify and be able to name the muscles. So before we get onto the actual muscle names themselves, again, skeletal muscles are controlled by our central nervous system and our peripheral nerves. So our central nervous system is our brain and our spinal cord, and obviously our brain is our central computer, and it will send out instructions down this motorway of nervous action, the spinal cord, which will then branch off to all the peripheral nerves that go all over our body. So our central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. Our peripheral nerves are all the ones that go to our muscles and to other organs all over the body. And in order to execute skills, the brain sends impulses down the spinal cord, down the peripheral nerves, to eventually make muscles contract. So nerves excite or innervate the muscles and make them contract. They generate tension in the muscles, and they pull on the tendons, which are attached to the bones, over a joint, and hopefully movement happens in most cases. So let's have a look at some of the joints and the muscles that work over them. So already we should know that muscles tend to work in pairs. You have an agonist that does the main action or contracts to generate the main action, the movement, and you have a partner muscle that lengthens, relaxes, and controls the movement and allows the movement. So let's look at the shoulder joint. We have got trapezius, this kite-shaped, obviously the same, it is mirrored on the other side of the vertebral column, but the trapezius, if we do shoulder shrugs, this part of the trapezius will contract to raise, to elevate our shoulder. So elevation is by the trapezius, and you can see that the strands, the fibres of the trapezius actually go in all sorts of different directions. So if we were to pull or retract our scapulae, it again would be our trapezius contributing towards that movement, as well as other muscles like rhomboids. So they do work, or also pulling the shoulder down to depress, or depression at the scapulae, the shoulder girdle. The trapezius would pull down and contract in that way as well. So it's quite a multifunctional muscle. Here you can also see latissimus dorsi, and the reason I've put this image is latissimus dorsi is this big muscle basically around our side, but it attaches to our humerus. So it would be the agonist for adduction when the arm is pulled downwards, and the middle deltoids would be the agonist for abduction when the arm is pulled upwards away from the midline. So latissimus dorsi and middle deltoid are partnered or paired muscles. Now the deltoids are actually three parts. So you've got the middle section, you've got the front anterior section, and you've got the posterior rear section. Middle and latissimus dorsi are paired, and anterior and posterior paired. So flexion of the shoulder joint, this movement forwards as if you're marching, would be the anterior deltoid, and pulling the arm backwards when you're walking or marching or running would be posterior deltoid. That would be the extensor. So the anterior deltoid creates flexion at the shoulder joint, and posterior creates extension at the shoulder joint. Again, focusing on the shoulder, so there are some very clever muscles, a group of 4 muscles that rotate our shoulder. Remember that we've got this ball and socket joint that is multi-axial. It can work in all three planes. The flexion and extension that I showed you earlier, let me just go back. Flexion and extension are in the sagittal plane. The abduction and adduction are in the frontal plane, and rotation is in the transverse plane. And we've got these four little muscles that hold on to the humerus head, and when they contract, pull it in various directions to rotate this bone about its own axis. So supraspinatus, infraspinatus, subscapularis and teres minor are the four rotator cuff muscles. So you can palpate these. This is the posterior view, so this would be looking at your back. This would be the person's right shoulder. This anterior view, there's no chance of you touching these muscles. These are literally the other side of your scapula. So on your insides, there would be your chest and your lungs in front of these. So they're the four rotator cuff muscles that medially and laterally rotate your humerus at the shoulder joint. On the right here we can see another diagram that looks actually quite complicated. It's divided into two halves to show the more superficial muscles, the muscles that are more on the skin surface, if you like, so deltoid, trapezius. Beneath that, so slightly deeper than the surface, are the rotator cuff muscles, teres minor, and again beneath that, serratus anterior. The deeper muscles, so muscles that are away from the skin surface, more towards the centre of the body, are shown here. So the rhomboids are deep muscles. So there would be rhomboids underneath on this side, underneath trapezius. And levator scapulae, so this muscle would contract to elevate the scapulae to raise your shoulders when you're shrugging upwards and you don't know an answer to something. So yeah, it shows the more superficial and the more deep muscles. Still on the shoulder, I think this is the last one about the shoulder. When we have horizontal flexion, we have the arm, the humerus is pulled across the body towards the midline by our pectoralis major. There is another muscle underneath, so it would be on both sides, but it's just showing you this is the superficial muscle, the muscle that's on the top, and this is the deep muscle, pectoralis minor, and that would be underneath on both sides, and the pec major would be obviously on top on this side. Posteriorly then we've got latissimus dorsi, which we've identified already, and then again it shows the rhomboids here and teres major. So protraction would be the pectoralis muscles, retraction would be rhomboids and teres minor, that pulling back of the shoulder blades. Last muscle that kind of isn't really shoulder but is a little bit more neck movements, perhaps you could argue moving the tilting the head to the side or turning the head, and this is sternocleidomastoid. So it attaches to your sternum, to your clavicle, and to the mastoid process, this lump on the back of your skull. So this is sternocleidomastoid, very important in rotating the neck and pulling the neck, let's say pulling your ear down to your shoulder. Okay, let's move down the body then to the elbow joint. Hopefully this is a very brief one because we should all know biceps brachii and triceps brachii, the elbow arm flexors and arm extensors. And then the radioulnar joint, which you just about see up here. So that bone there is the head of the radius, which is a pivot joint, which it goes in the notch here, this notch, this V-shaped notch on the ulna. We have pronator muscles and we have supinator muscles. They're pretty easy to remember because the supinator muscle creates supination and the pronator teres muscle creates pronation. So they should hopefully be quite easy to remember, supinators and pronators. Similarly, hopefully easy to remember, if you were going to shoot a basketball, the final execution of the wrist action, that flick forward, is wrist flexion, and that would be your wrist flexors. So the underneath of your forearm is wrist flexors. If you were in the preparatory position to shoot, so the ball was cupped in your hand, you basically cocked your wrist, that would be your wrist extensors, pulling your hand backwards and upwards, if you like. Okay, so let's look at the trunk. So the trunk is your around your waist really, and your, this band around the middle of you. We've got some more superficial muscles, and the muscles that are superficial are more towards the skin surface, the surface of your body, rather than deep within your body. The more superficial muscles are rectus abdominis here and external obliques. So the obliques are on your sides there. We've also got some deep muscles, and these are what we would understand as our core muscles. Multifidus is at your lumbar region. Transverse abdominis, so transverse means goes around your abdominis, your middle, and your pelvic floor, and those three with the diaphragm at the top almost make a protective box, which is your core. And these are the muscles that we need to train to protect our vulnerable vertebral column here. Remember this is where so much force and stress and twisting and turning and lifting happens. So we need strong core muscles, which is these, to protect our trunk. Also, we want strong core muscles because a lot of our sporting actions transfer force from our legs. If you think about shot put or rowing, we generate the power from our legs that is transmitted through our core to other limbs. A shot put, we generate the force from our legs, we rotate, and eventually the force goes through our arm and through the putt itself. Now, if we've got weak core, we lose a lot of the force that we've generated at this point. It doesn't get to the arm. In tennis, in serving, we generate the force initially from the drive from our legs, it's transmitted through our core and goes on up. So the core really is multifunctional. It's protective, and it's also really important in transferring force through our body from our big powerful legs to our other limbs, upper body. The obliques, I think I show you in a moment anyway, they're really important for rotation at the hip, so twisting and turning at our lumbar, and for lateral flexion and extension, so the sideways movement, but I think I'll show you that in a minute. Okay, trunk again. If we were to extend at the trunk, i.e. lean backwards, it's all about erector spinae. So we've got this group of muscles that go all the way up and down the vertebral column. So that's erector spinae. If they contract, it pulls our back backwards. And then the partner group to that are rectus abdominis. So in a sit-up, these would create flexion at the trunk. They would sit us up. If we were laying on our tummy, we wanted to do a back arc raise, then it would be erector spinae that did it. This diagram, a bit tiny, but just pause the video and have a little closer look, but it shows external obliques, internal obliques, which are important for lateral, this one is rotational movement, so the twisting and turning at our trunk, and this one shows them actually also being involved in lateral flexion and extension as well. Moving on to the hip. So hip flexors, iliopsoas. So the iliacus and the psoas muscle actually connect through the same tendon, and I think this is collectively called iliopsoas. The main hip flexor, there are other muscles like tensor fascia lata, TFL, that assist with that. And the partner muscle, so that would be hip flexion. Hip extension, putting our leg out behind us from the hip, is our gluteus maximus, that big bottom muscle. Ignore the medius bit there. It's the agonist for hip flexion is iliopsoas, and the agonist for hip extension is gluteus maximus. If we were to wish for abduction at the hip, so moving the leg out sideways in the frontal plane, it would be gluteus medius and minimus, the bottom muscles that are a little bit more round to the side. So they contract to pull the femur sideways outwards. And the opposing or partner muscles to that are the adductors, and that they're a group of 3 muscles. Adductor brevis, which means brevis means shortest, longus means longer, and magnus means strongest. So brevis, longus, magnus, all the adductor muscles. So they pull the femur in towards the midline. These 2 muscles pull the femur out to the side for abduction. Okay, so moving on to the knee joint then. Hopefully these are familiar. So we've got our hamstring muscle group on the posterior thigh, posterior side of the femur, attaching at the pelvis and below the knee. We've got 3 muscles that make up the hamstring group: semitendinosus, semimembranosus, and the biceps femoris. On the opposite side of the thigh, the anterior view, we've got the quadricep muscle group, the 4 muscles that make up this group, again attaching at the pelvis and below the knee, the tibia. We've got vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, so towards the middle, towards the side, and then vastus intermedius, obviously in between, and then rectus femoris. I would at least encourage you to maybe learn one proper name of each of them. Rectus femoris might be the easiest, and biceps femoris, because it's similar. Biceps do flexion, remember. Rectus femoris is the extensor. Next then, the ankle joint. So we have, again, familiar muscles hopefully. The posterior view shows the gastrocnemius and the soleus or soleus, which attach through the Achilles tendon to the calcaneus, the heel bone. So when these muscles contract, they pull on the heel bone and plantar flexion occurs at the ankle joint. In contrast then, on the front or the anterior tibialis is the muscle on the front of the tibia, and when it contracts it pulls on the foot really and pulls for dorsiflexion to happen at the ankle joint. So I've kind of gone through the muscle pairs as best as possible, joint by joint by joint. If you wish to pause the video and have a look at these and take time to digest, this is from one of the textbooks. It basically lists all the muscles, the primary function that they have, roughly where they are. It states where the origin and insertion is, the tendon that is at the fixed end, generally the proximal end, and the tendon that is at the insertion, generally the distal end, the furthest end away, and the sort of exercises that it might be involved in. So there's a few slides with all the different muscles on. Again, take your time, pause the video, have a look at these as you go. That was one textbook, and just in case you find this one easier, this is the other textbook. Again, you can pause and it gives you all the same information.